In July 1918, Bolshevik soldiers discovered something remarkable hidden in the clothes of the executed Romanov princesses. As they stripped the bodies for burial, they found diamonds, rubies, and pearls sewn into the corsets and undergarments of the 4 Grand Duchesses. The gems were so densely packed that bullets had actually ricocheted off the bodies during the execution, forcing the soldiers to finish the killing with bayonets. The imperial family had literally wrapped themselves in the wealth of their empire, hoping these hidden treasures might buy their freedom or finance their escape. They were wrong, but the image is haunting. A dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years, reduced to smuggling jewels in their underwear. The Romanovs had once commanded the largest empire on earth, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the borders of Persia. They had built palaces that rivaled Versailles, assembled art collections that filled dozens of museums, and maintained a court of legendary extravagance. At their height, the Romanovs were among the wealthiest royal families in history, their personal fortune estimated at billions of dollars in today's money. Yet this immense wealth was built on a foundation of human suffering that makes the story of Romanov finances one of history's darkest tales. For 3 centuries, the Romanovs financed their empire through the systematic exploitation of the Russian people on a scale almost unprecedented in human history. They taxed peasants until they starved, then taxed them more when they tried to recover. They maintained serfdom, a system of near slavery longer than any other European power. Not out of ideology, but because it was profitable. They borrowed from foreign bankers at ruinous rates, mortgaging Russia's future to pay for today's wars and palaces. They exported grain during famines, letting millions die so that the empire could meet its foreign loan payments. And when the system finally collapsed, when the people rose up and demanded change, the Romanovs discovered that all their gold couldn't save them. This is the story of how the Romanovs financed their empire: the taxes and the debts, the gold and the blood, the brilliant schemes and catastrophic miscalculations. It's a story about what happens when absolute power meets insatiable need, and how the bill always comes due in the end. The Romanov dynasty began not with gold, but with chaos. In 1613, Russia was emerging from one of the darkest periods in its history, a time of foreign invasion, civil war, and famine known as the Time of Troubles. The previous dynasty, the Rurikids, had died out, and various pretenders and foreign powers had torn the country apart for over a decade. The country was exhausted, impoverished, and desperate for stability above all else. A council of nobles, clergy, and townspeople gathered in Moscow to choose a new czar, and their choice fell on Michael Romanov, a 16-year-old boy. Michael was chosen not because he was strong or capable, but because he was weak and connected to the old dynasty through marriage. The nobles who selected him expected to control him, and for a time they did. But the Romanovs proved more resilient than anyone expected, and within a few generations, they had established an autocracy more absolute than anything Russia had seen before. The foundation of Romanov power was simple: control of the land and the people who worked it. Russia was an agricultural society, and agriculture meant grain, and grain meant peasants. The peasants of Russia were not free farmers like those in Western Europe, but serfs, bound to the land they worked and subject to the authority of their noble masters. Serfdom had existed in Russia for centuries, but under the early Romanovs, it became more systematic and more oppressive than ever before. In 1649, the law code of Tsar Alexis formally abolished any time limit on recovering runaway serfs, making their bondage permanent and hereditary. Serfs could be bought and sold, punished at their master's whim, separated from their families, and forced to work without compensation. They were, in everything but name, slaves, and their labor was the engine that powered the Russian state. The system worked like this. Nobles received land grants from the Tsar in exchange for military and administrative service. The serfs who lived on that land were obligated to work for the noble, either by farming his fields directly or by paying him dues in cash or kind. The nobles, in turn, paid taxes to the Tsar and provided soldiers for his armies. At every level, wealth flowed upward. extracted from the labor of millions of peasants who received almost nothing in return. This system kept Russia perpetually poor compared to Western Europe, because serfs had no incentive to innovate or improve their productivity. Why work harder when any surplus would simply be taken by your master or the tax collector? The Romanovs understood this problem, but they also understood that serfdom was what kept the nobles loyal and the army supplied. Reform would threaten the entire social order, so reform was perpetually delayed. The early Romanovs were not particularly extravagant by the standards of European monarchs. They lived in relative simplicity compared to the courts of France or Spain, and their primary concern was survival rather than splendor. The treasury was chronically empty, forcing the czars to rely on creative expedients to fund their government. Salt taxes were a reliable source of revenue, since everyone needed salt to preserve food through the long Russian winters. When the government tried to raise salt taxes dramatically in 1648, the result was widespread riots that nearly toppled Tsar Alexis. The government also taxed alcohol, eventually establishing a state monopoly on vodka production that would become one of the most reliable sources of Romanov income. By the late 17th century, as much as a third of government revenue came from the vodka monopoly, essentially taxing the Russian people's misery. Foreign trade was another source of income, particularly the fur trade that brought Russian sables, ermines, and foxes to the luxury markets of Europe. The Tsar maintained a monopoly on the most valuable furs, with agents ranging across Siberia to collect pelts from native peoples, often through brutal coercion. This fur trade helped finance the expansion of Russian territory across the vast Siberian wilderness, as Cossack adventurers pushed ever eastward in search of new hunting grounds. But the real transformation of Romanov finances came with Peter the Great, who inherited a medieval kingdom and determined to make it a European power. Peter I, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, was unlike any Russian ruler before him. He was physically enormous, nearly 7 feet tall, with boundless energy and insatiable curiosity about Western technology and methods. He traveled to Western Europe incognito, working in shipyards and factories to learn how things were made. He came back determined to modernize Russia, to build a navy, to create industries, to remake his country in the image of the advanced nations of the West. All of this would cost money, vastly more money than Russia had ever spent on anything. Peter's first major expense was the Great Northern War against Sweden, which lasted from 1700 to 1721 and consumed resources on an unprecedented scale. The Swedish army was one of the best in Europe, and defeating it required Russia to build a modern military almost from scratch. Peter created a standing army of over 200,000 men, equipped with modern weapons and trained in European tactics. He built a navy from nothing, constructing hundreds of ships in newly established shipyards along the Baltic coast. All of this required not just money but also materials, skilled workers, and a complete transformation of the Russian economy. Peter financed his wars through a combination of old and new methods, squeezing every possible kopeck from the Russian population. He reformed the tax system, replacing the old household tax with the soul tax, levied on every male peasant regardless of age or ability to pay. This new tax was brutally efficient, increasing government revenue dramatically, but also increasing the burden on peasants who were already barely surviving. Peter also created new state monopolies on essential goods: salt, tobacco, tar, potash, rhubarb, extracting profits that went directly to the war effort. He debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins while maintaining their face value, essentially stealing from everyone who held money. He confiscated church bells and melted them down to make cannons, combining financial pragmatism with a deliberate assault on the power of the Orthodox Church. He forced nobles to serve in the army or bureaucracy, transforming the Russian aristocracy from feudal landowners into servants of the state. And he built St. Petersburg. The construction of St. Petersburg was Peter's grandest and most expensive project, a new capital city built from nothing on the swampy shores of the Baltic Sea. Peter wanted a window to Europe, a modern city that would demonstrate Russia's new status as a European power. The location was terrible, marshy, flood-prone, with a climate that killed construction workers by the thousands. But Peter didn't care about costs, whether measured in money or in lives. He conscripted hundreds of thousands of peasants to drain swamps, drive pilings, and build the magnificent palaces and boulevards he envisioned. Modern historians estimate that between 30,000 and 100,000 workers died during the construction, from disease, accidents, and the brutal conditions. Peter forced nobles to build houses in his new city, specifying the size and style of construction based on their rank. He compelled merchants to relocate from Moscow, redirecting trade through the new capital, whether it made economic sense or not. The cost was staggering, consuming perhaps a quarter of the entire state budget during the peak construction years. But when Peter died in 1725, Russia was transformed a European power with modern institutions, a formidable military, and debts that would take generations to repay. The pattern was set. Romanov rulers would pursue ambitious goals regardless of cost, financing them through the sweat and blood of the Russian people. The successors of Peter the Great struggled to maintain his vision while managing the financial chaos he left behind. The decades after his death saw a succession of weak rulers, palace coups, and chronic budget deficits. Russia's economy couldn't generate enough revenue to support Peter's military establishment, let alone expand it. The empire lurched from crisis to crisis, borrowing from foreign bankers at high interest rates, debasing the currency further, and always squeezing the peasants harder. The sole tax that Peter had imposed became the foundation of state finance, and it fell most heavily on those least able to pay. Serfs who couldn't pay the tax might be flogged, imprisoned, or sold to new masters in distant regions. Villages that fell behind on their obligations faced collective punishment, with soldiers quartered on them till the debts were paid. The result was widespread poverty and periodic famines that killed millions, but barely registered in the concerns of the court. The Romanovs continued to live in splendor, building new palaces and importing luxuries from Europe while their subjects starved. This disconnect between the wealth of the court and the poverty of the people would only grow more extreme over the following centuries. Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, represented both the heights of Romanov power and the contradictions at its core. She was German by birth, a minor princess who had married the heir to the Russian throne, and then overthrew her own husband to seize power. She was brilliant, cultivated, and ambitious, corresponding with the great philosophers of the Enlightenment and styling herself as an enlightened monarch. She was also utterly ruthless, expanding serfdom to new territories, crushing peasant rebellions with extreme violence, and never letting moral considerations interfere with state interest. Catherine's reign saw massive territorial expansion, adding vast territories in the south and west, at the expense of the Ottoman Empire and Poland. These conquests were expensive, requiring armies and navies and the infrastructure to support them. But they also brought new revenues and new resources. The newly acquired lands of Ukraine and the Black Sea coast would become some of Russia's most productive agricultural regions, exporting grain to European markets. But expansion also meant new costs, new fortresses to build, new bureaucracies to staff, new minorities to suppress. Catherine financed her ambitions partly through foreign loans, beginning Russia's long and troubled relationship with European banking houses. Dutch and British bankers were happy to lend to the Russian crown, attracted by high interest rates and the apparent stability of the autocracy. These loans would grow over the following century until foreign debt became one of the defining constraints on Russian policy. Catherine also continued and expanded the vodka monopoly, understanding that taxing alcohol was both profitable and politically useful. A drunken peasantry was less likely to organize resistance, and the revenues from their drinking helped pay for the empire's expansion. By Catherine's death in 1796, Russia was one of the great powers of Europe, feared for its military might and coveted for its resources, but the empire's finances remained precarious, dependent on the continued exploitation of a peasant population that was growing increasingly restless. The contradictions that would eventually destroy the Romanovs were already visible to anyone willing to look. The 19th century would prove to be the most transformative and turbulent period in the history of Romanov finances, as the empire struggled to modernize while maintaining the autocratic system that the dynasty depended upon for its survival. The century began with one of the greatest military challenges the Romanovs had ever faced: Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Russia in 1812, which would test the empire's resources to their absolute limits. Napoleon led the largest army ever assembled in European history, over 600,000 men, into Russian territory, expecting a quick victory over what he considered a backward nation incapable of serious resistance. The Russian strategy was to retreat, trading space for time, burning crops and villages to deny the French army the supplies it needed to survive, a brutal tactic that sacrificed the Russian peasantry to defeat the invader. The serfs whose homes and harvests were destroyed received no compensation. Their suffering was simply the price of victory, unremarked and uncompensated by the government that demanded their sacrifice. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found a city that had been deliberately set ablaze by its own inhabitants, denying him the shelter and supplies he desperately needed as winter approached. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest military disasters in history, with the Grand Army destroyed by cold, hunger, disease, and relentless Russian attacks on the fleeing columns. Russia emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as one of the dominant powers in Europe, but the victory had come at an enormous cost in lives, treasure, and economic devastation across the western provinces. The government had financed the war partly through massive printing of paper rubles, which created rampant inflation that wiped out savings and disrupted commerce throughout the empire. It would take decades for the Russian economy to recover from the inflationary shock, and the paper ruble would remain unstable and distrusted for most of the 19th century. Foreign loans also increased dramatically during and after the war, as the Russian government borrowed from Dutch, British, and later French banking houses to cover its mounting deficits. By 1815, Russia was victorious, but deeply in debt, its economy disrupted, its currency debased, and its peasant population more impoverished than ever despite their crucial role in defeating Napoleon. Tsar Alexander I, who had led Russia through the Napoleonic Wars, began his reign as a reformer who talked about constitutional government and the abolition of serfdom. He ended his reign as a reactionary who suppressed dissent, abandoned reform, and left the fundamental problems of Russian society untouched for his successors to deal with. The brief liberal moment after 1815 gave way to decades of repression under Alexander's brother Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855 with an iron determination to preserve autocracy unchanged. Nicholas I has been called the Iron Tsar for his rigid commitment to maintaining order, suppressing revolution, and preventing any change that might weaken the absolute power of the crown. His approach to finance was equally conservative: balance the budget, maintain the currency, avoid foreign entanglements that might require expensive military commitments, and above all, preserve the serf system that kept the nobles loyal. Under Nicholas, the finance ministry became one of the most powerful institutions in the Russian government, controlling not just taxation and spending, but much of economic policy as well. The ministry worked to stabilize the currency, finally establishing a silver-backed ruble in 1843 that provided the first reliable money Russia had known in decades, and facilitated both domestic and international commerce. But stabilizing the currency meant keeping government spending under tight control, which in turn meant limiting the military modernization that Russia desperately needed to remain competitive with Western powers. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brutally exposed the consequences of this approach, as Russia found itself outmatched by French and British forces equipped with modern weapons and supported by industrial economies. Russian soldiers armed with outdated muskets faced enemies carrying rifles with 5 times the range. Russian supply lines that depended on horses and carts faced enemies supplied by steamships and railroads. The war ended in humiliating defeat, with Russia forced to accept terms that demolished its pretensions to great power status and exposed the backwardness of its military and economy. Nicholas I died during the war, reportedly of despair at the catastrophe unfolding around him, and his successor Alexander II inherited an empire in crisis that demanded fundamental reform. Alexander II became known as the Tsar Liberator for his most famous act, the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, which freed some 23 million human beings from legal bondage. The emancipation was driven partly by moral considerations. Serfdom was increasingly seen as barbaric even by Russian elites, but mainly by economic and military necessity. The Crimean War had demonstrated that a nation of serfs could not compete with industrial powers whose free workers could be mobilized into modern armies and productive factories. Serf labor was inherently inefficient because serfs had no incentive to work hard or innovate. They simply did the minimum necessary to avoid punishment and kept any surplus hidden from their masters. Russia needed a free labor force that could move to where jobs were, acquire skills, and respond to economic incentives if the empire was ever to industrialize and catch up with the West. But emancipation created enormous financial complications that would shape Russian policy for the rest of the Romanov era and contribute directly to the dynasty's eventual fall. The nobles who lost their serfs demanded compensation, and the government agreed to pay them through a complex system of bonds that increased the national debt substantially. The freed serfs were expected to pay for their land through redemption payments stretched over 49 years, essentially forcing them to pay twice for freedom that should have been theirs by right. These redemption payments became a crushing burden on the peasantry, who often found themselves paying more in annual dues than they had owed under serfdom, while receiving less land than they needed to survive. The government collected the redemption payments and used them to pay the noble bondholders, but the system was chronically underfunded because peasants simply couldn't afford what they were asked to pay. Arrears accumulated year after year, and the government's attempts to collect them through force only increased peasant resentment and contributed to the revolutionary sentiments that would eventually boil over. Meanwhile, the freed serfs discovered that legal freedom meant little without economic freedom, as they remained trapped in poverty, tied to their villages by the redemption system, and subject to the authority of the peasant commune. The decades following emancipation saw Russia embark on an ambitious program of industrialization that would transform the empire's economy while creating new financial pressures that strained the government to its limits. The key insight of Russian policymakers was that industrialization required railroads, and railroads required massive capital investment that could only come from foreign sources. Russia's domestic capital markets were tiny and underdeveloped, its merchants and nobles lacked the resources to finance major projects, and its banking system was primitive compared to Western Europe. The solution was to borrow from abroad, attracting foreign investment through high interest rates, government guarantees, and the promise of access to Russia's vast resources and markets. French capital proved particularly important, as French banks and investors poured billions of francs into Russian railroads, mines, and factories, becoming the largest foreign creditors of the Romanov state. This financial relationship would have profound political consequences, drawing France and Russia into an alliance that would shape the geopolitics of Europe and eventually lead both nations into the catastrophe of World War I. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, was the most ambitious and expensive infrastructure project of the era, stretching over 5,700 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. Building the railroad required not just money, but also an enormous mobilization of labor, materials, and engineering expertise across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The government financed the project through a combination of domestic taxes, foreign loans, and bond issues that increased the national debt substantially while creating a strategic asset of incalculable value. The railroad opened Siberia to settlement and development, allowed the exploitation of mineral resources that had previously been inaccessible, and strengthened Russian control over its vast Far Eastern territories. But it also increased Russia's vulnerability by extending its commitments thousands of miles from the centers of power, a vulnerability that would be brutally exposed in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The architect of Russia's industrial and financial transformation was Sergei Witt, who served as finance minister from 1892 to 1903 and pursued modernization with a single-minded determination that left a permanent mark on the Russian economy. Witt believed that Russia's survival as a great power depended on rapid industrialization, and he was willing to use every tool at the state's disposal to achieve this goal, regardless of the social costs. His most significant reform was putting Russia on the gold standard in 1897, a move that stabilized the ruble, attracted foreign investment, and integrated Russia into the international financial system. The gold standard meant that every ruble in circulation was backed by gold reserves, ensuring that the currency would maintain its value and that foreign investors could trust Russian financial commitments. But maintaining the gold standard required accumulating enormous gold reserves, which Witt achieved through a combination of aggressive taxation, export promotion, and policies that kept domestic consumption artificially low. Russia became one of the world's largest grain exporters during this period, shipping millions of tons of wheat to Western markets even during years when the harvest was poor and Russian peasants faced hunger. "We may go hungry, but we will export," was the unofficial motto of Witt's ministry, and the policy was implemented with ruthless efficiency that prioritized gold accumulation over human welfare. The grain exports generated the foreign exchange needed to service Russia's growing foreign debt and to pay for the imported machinery and materials that industrialization required. But they also meant that Russian peasants ate less, so that Western Europeans could eat more, a transfer of resources from the poorest people in the empire to the richest nations in the world. Famines became more frequent and more deadly during this period, with the Great Famine of 1891 to 1892 killing perhaps 400,000 people, while the government continued to export grain to maintain its trade balance. The industrial growth that Witt's policies achieved was genuinely impressive, transforming Russia from an agricultural backwater into a significant industrial power in the space of 2 decades. Railroad mileage increased dramatically, heavy industry expanded, coal and steel production soared, and Russian factories began producing modern machinery and weapons that had previously been imported. Foreign investment flooded into the country, creating new enterprises, transferring technology, and building the infrastructure that a modern economy required. By 1914, Russia had the 4th largest industrial economy in the world, with growth rates that exceeded those of Britain, France, or Germany during the same period. But this impressive growth was built on a foundation of foreign debt and domestic exploitation that made the entire system fundamentally unstable and vulnerable to shocks. Russia's foreign debt by 1914 was approximately 8 billion rubles, the largest of any nation in the world, with annual interest payments consuming a significant portion of government revenue. The French held roughly 80% of this debt, making Russia financially dependent on a single foreign creditor whose interests might not always align with Russia's own. Servicing this debt required maintaining the grain exports that kept peasants in poverty, the high taxes that stunted domestic consumption, and the gold standard that limited the government's ability to respond to economic crises. The industrial workers who staffed the new factories lived in appalling conditions, crowded into urban slums, working long hours for minimal wages, and subject to brutal discipline by foreign managers who often couldn't speak Russian. These workers, concentrated in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, would form the nucleus of the revolutionary movements that threatened the Romanov regime with increasing intensity as the new century dawned. The contradiction at the heart of Witt's program was that modernization required an educated, mobile, and increasingly politically conscious population that was less and less willing to accept autocratic rule. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 exposed all the weaknesses of the Romanov system in the most humiliating way possible, as the mighty Russian Empire was defeated by an Asian nation that Europeans had dismissed as backward. The war began with Japanese surprise attacks on Russian forces in Manchuria and Korea, where Russian expansion had threatened Japanese interests and provoked a conflict that the Russian government had not expected and was not prepared to fight. Russian forces suffered defeat after defeat, on land and at sea. As Japanese armies proved better led, better equipped, and better motivated than their Russian counterparts, the crowning humiliation came at the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, when the Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet after it had sailed halfway around the world to reach the war zone. The war cost Russia approximately 2.5 billion rubles, money that had to be borrowed from foreign creditors at a time when the government's finances were already strained to the breaking point. More damaging than the financial cost was the political impact, as defeat abroad combined with economic hardship at home to produce the Revolution of 1905, the first serious challenge to Romanov rule. Workers went on strike across the empire, peasants rose against their landlords, and even the military showed signs of disaffection, with the famous mutiny on the battleship Potemkin symbolizing the rot within the system. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to grant concessions he never intended to keep, including a constitution, an elected parliament called the Duma, and promises of civil liberties that were systematically violated in the years that followed. The revolution was suppressed through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and a massive loan from France that allowed the government to stabilize its finances and reassert control. This loan of 2.25 billion francs, the largest single loan in history up to that point, came with political strings attached, binding Russia more closely to France and the alliance system that would lead to World War. The years between 1905 and 1914 saw Russia attempt to recover from the disasters of war and revolution, while maintaining the autocratic system that had created those disasters in the first place. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin pursued an ambitious program of agricultural reform, designed to create a class of prosperous peasant farmers who would have a stake in the existing order and resist revolutionary agitation. His reforms allowed peasants to leave the commune and consolidate their scattered strips of land into private farms, hoping to create a rural middle class that would support the regime. The program showed some success, with agricultural productivity increasing and a new class of kulak farmers emerging who might have stabilized Russian society if given enough time. But Stolypin was assassinated in 1911, and his reforms lost momentum as war approached and the government's attention shifted to military preparation. The military buildup required enormous expenditures that pushed Russian finances to the breaking point, with defense spending consuming an ever larger share of the budget each year. Russia's alliance with France required maintaining an army large enough to threaten Germany from the east, forcing the Germans to fight on two fronts in any European war. This strategic commitment meant maintaining an army of over 1.4 million men in peacetime, with the capacity to mobilize millions more within weeks of a war declaration. The cost of this military establishment consumed approximately 25% of government spending by 1914, leaving little for economic development, social services, or the reforms that might have diffused revolutionary pressures. Foreign debt continued to grow, with annual interest payments consuming approximately 14% of government revenue money that flowed out of Russia to French, British, and Belgian bondholders. When the guns of August 1914 announced the beginning of World War I, the Romanov dynasty faced a financial and military challenge that would prove beyond the capacity of their antiquated system to manage. Russia entered the war with an economy that was growing but still fundamentally fragile, dependent on foreign capital, foreign technology, and the continued exploitation of a peasant population that had never fully recovered from centuries of oppression. The initial enthusiasm for war was genuine, with patriotic crowds filling the streets of St. Petersburg and Moscow, but this enthusiasm would not survive the grinding reality of modern industrial warfare. The Russian army was the largest in Europe, with the capacity to mobilize over 5 million men within weeks of the declaration of war. But size alone could not compensate for critical weaknesses in equipment, training, and leadership. Russian factories could not produce enough rifles, artillery shells, or boots to equip the vast armies that were being thrown against the German and Austro-Hungarian forces on the Eastern Front. In the first months of the war, Some Russian soldiers went into battle without weapons, ordered to pick up rifles from their fallen comrades, a scandal that revealed the depth of the industrial and logistical failures. The government attempted to address these shortages through massive emergency spending, placing orders with domestic and foreign suppliers, but the money flowed out faster than the weapons flowed in. War expenditures quickly exceeded anything the Russian economy could sustain through normal taxation, forcing the government to resort to desperate measures that would ultimately destroy the financial system. The gold standard that Sergei Witt had so carefully constructed was abandoned within days of the war's outbreak, as the government needed freedom to print money without the constraints of gold reserves. Paper rubles flooded the economy in ever-increasing quantities, with the money supply roughly quadrupling between 1914 and 1917, creating inflation that eroded the purchasing power of everyone who depended on fixed incomes. Prices rose faster than wages, and the urban workers who had been the backbone of Russia's industrial growth found themselves unable to afford food, fuel, or the basic necessities of life. The peasants who produced the food hoarded their grain rather than sell it for paper money that lost value by the day, creating shortages in the cities that fueled discontent and revolutionary sentiment. Foreign loans continued to pour into Russia during the war years, as France and Britain had every incentive to keep their eastern ally in the fight against Germany. By 1917, Russia's foreign debt had grown to approximately 13.8 billion rubles, a staggering sum that represented a mortgage on the country's future that could never realistically be repaid. The interest payments on this debt would have consumed a crippling portion of government revenue for decades. Had the Romanov government survived long enough to face the reckoning, Allied loans came with strings attached, including requirements that Russia maintain its offensive operations on the Eastern Front regardless of the human cost or the domestic political consequences. Each offensive required more men, more money, more resources that the Russian economy simply could not provide. And each failure, and there were many failures, eroded the government's legitimacy further. The Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 saw an entire Russian army destroyed, with 90,000 men killed or captured in a single catastrophic engagement that set the tone for the disasters to come. The Great Offensive of 1916, named after General Brusilov, initially succeeded spectacularly, capturing hundreds of thousands of Austro-Hungarian prisoners, but ultimately stalled with enormous Russian casualties that the country could not replace. By 1917, Russia had suffered approximately 5.5 million casualties killed, wounded, and captured, a hemorrhage of manpower that was bleeding the empire white and destroying the army's will to fight. Soldiers increasingly questioned why they were dying in a war that seemed to benefit only the wealthy and the powerful, while their families starved in villages stripped of men and resources. Desertion became epidemic, with soldiers simply walking away from the front and heading home, often taking their weapons with them, creating an armed and angry peasantry that would soon turn against the regime. The financial chaos of the war years was compounded by corruption, incompetence, and the bizarre influence of Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian mystic who had gained influence over the imperial family through his apparent ability to help their hemophiliac son. Rasputin's influence over appointments and policy decisions scandalized Russian society and undermined whatever remaining confidence the public had in the competence of the government. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's recommendations, creating chaos in the administration at precisely the moment when competent leadership was most desperately needed. The Empress Alexandra, who increasingly dominated her weak husband Nicholas II, relied on Rasputin's advice and defended him against all criticism, alienating the aristocracy and the military leadership. Rumors spread that Rasputin was a German agent, that the Empress herself was a traitor, that the government was deliberately sabotaging the war effort, rumors that were false, but that reflected the complete collapse of trust in the regime. When Rasputin was finally murdered in December 1916 by a group of nobles who hoped to save the monarchy by eliminating its most damaging associate, it was too late to repair the damage. The economy was in ruins, the army was disintegrating, the cities were starving, and the population had lost all faith in the ability of the Romanovs to lead the country through the crisis. The final collapse came with stunning speed, as a bread riot in Petrograd in February 1917 escalated into a full-scale revolution within the space of a few days. Soldiers ordered to suppress the demonstrations instead joined them, turning their weapons against their officers and the police, and the institutions of autocracy simply melted away. Nicholas II, isolated at military headquarters and completely out of touch with the reality of the situation, abdicated on March 2, 1917, ending 300 years of Romanov rule with the signature on a piece of paper. The provisional government that took power after the February Revolution inherited an impossible financial situation that would have challenged even the most competent administration. The treasury was empty. The currency was worthless. Foreign creditors were demanding repayment, and the war continued to consume resources that the country no longer possessed. The new government chose to continue the war, partly out of genuine belief in the Allied cause, but also because abandoning the struggle would mean defaulting on the massive debts owed to France and Britain. This decision to keep fighting proved fatal, as war-weary soldiers and workers had no patience for a government that promised democracy in the future while demanding sacrifice in the present. The Bolsheviks under Lenin offered a simple message: peace, land, and bread that resonated with the population exhausted by 3 years of war and centuries of exploitation. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, one of their first acts was to repudiate all debts incurred by the Tsarist and provisional governments, wiping out billions in foreign claims with the stroke of the pen. French investors who had poured their savings into Russian bonds, small savers, widows, pensioners lost everything, creating a bitterness that would poison Franco-Russian relations for decades. The Bolsheviks also nationalized all private property, confiscating the estates of nobles, the factories of industrialists, and the assets of banks without compensation. The entire financial edifice that the Romanovs had built over 3 centuries was demolished in a matter of months, replaced by a command economy that would prove equally dysfunctional in its own ways. The gold reserves that Witt had accumulated so painfully were scattered during the Civil War, with portions captured by various factions, shipped abroad, or simply lost in the chaos. The fate of the Romanov family itself embodied the total collapse of everything they had built and the terrible price they would pay for centuries of exploitation. Nicholas II and his family were initially placed under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace near Petrograd and later in distant Siberia, as the provisional government debated what to do with them. Proposals to send them into exile abroad came to nothing, as the British government, despite the fact that King George V was Nicholas's first cousin, refused to offer asylum for fear of domestic political consequences. The Bolsheviks moved the family to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, where they were held in a merchant's house surrounded by guards, waiting for a trial that would never happen. As white armies approached the city in July 1918, the local Bolshevik leadership decided to eliminate the family rather than risk their rescue and use as a rallying point for counter-revolution. On the night of July 17, 1918, the family was awakened and told they were being moved, then led to a basement room where a firing squad was waiting. The execution was botched and horrific, with bullets ricocheting off the jewels sewn into the women's clothes, forcing the guards to finish the killing with bayonets and pistol shots at close range. The bodies were stripped, burned, doused with acid, and buried in a shallow grave that would not be discovered until 1979, and not officially acknowledged until after the fall of the Soviet Union. The diamonds and rubies that the family had hidden in their clothes were gathered up by the executioners, the last remnants of the Romanov fortune, soaked in the blood of its final owners. Nicholas II, once the ruler of 1/6 of the world's land surface, commander of the largest army on earth, master of palaces filled with treasures beyond counting, ended his life in a basement, murdered by revolutionaries he had never understood. The question of what happened to the vast Romanov fortune has fascinated historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists for over a century, spawning countless legends and occasional frauds. The personal wealth of the Romanov family, distinct from the assets of the Russian state, was immense. including palaces, jewels, art collections, landholdings, and deposits in foreign banks. Estimates of this personal fortune vary wildly, from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars in modern terms, depending on how various assets are valued and which family members are included. Much of this wealth was in forms that could not be easily liquidated or removed from Russia: the palaces, the Faber-Gegs, the paintings and sculptures, the furniture and decorative arts. The Bolsheviks confiscated all of this, some of it ending up in Soviet museums, some of it sold abroad to raise foreign currency, and some of it simply disappearing into the chaos of revolution and civil war. The crown jewels of the Russian Empire, including some of the largest diamonds in the world, were secured by the Bolsheviks and remain in the Kremlin's diamond fund to this day. But persistent rumors suggested that significant assets had been hidden abroad before the revolution, in banks in London, Paris, and Berlin, waiting to be claimed by surviving family members. Several Romanov relatives did escape Russia and lived in exile, some in considerable comfort and others in relative poverty, depending on what resources they had managed to take with them. The most famous claimant to Romanov wealth was Anna Anderson, who claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia and spent decades pursuing legal recognition and inheritance rights before DNA testing eventually proved she was an imposter. The legal battles over Romanov assets continued for decades, with various parties claiming ownership of deposits, properties, and artworks scattered across Europe and America. What lessons can we draw from 3 centuries of Romanov financial history? And what does their story tell us about the relationship between wealth, power, and responsibility? The most obvious lesson is that wealth extracted through exploitation rather than created through productive activity is ultimately unstable and unsustainable. The Romanovs built their empire on the backs of serfs who were treated as property, and even after emancipation, they continued to extract wealth from peasants who had no voice in how they were governed. This system generated the revenues needed to maintain autocratic power in the short term, but it stunted economic development, bred resentment, and ultimately created the revolutionary pressures that destroyed the dynasty. A more enlightened approach, investing in education, encouraging entrepreneurship, allowing political participation, might have created a wealthier and more stable society that could have supported the Romanovs indefinitely. But such reforms would have required sharing power, and the Romanovs were never willing to share power until it was far too late, and the concessions they offered were seen as weakness rather than wisdom. The second lesson is about the dangers of foreign debt and the way that financial dependence can constrain a nation's freedom of action in ways that may not be apparent until crisis strikes. Russia's dependence on French capital tied the empire to an alliance system that led directly to World War I, a war that Russia was not prepared to fight and that ultimately destroyed the regime. The loans that seemed so beneficial in peacetime, financing railroads, factories, and military modernization, became chains that bound Russia to policies that served French interests more than Russian interests. When the crunch came, Russia had to keep fighting a war that was destroying its society because the alternative was financial default and the loss of the foreign support that kept the government functioning. The third lesson concerns the relationship between economic modernization and political reform, and the impossibility of achieving one without the other in the long run. Sergei Witt and his successors believed that Russia could modernize its economy while maintaining autocratic government, importing Western technology and capital without importing Western political ideas. This approach achieved impressive short-term results, with industrial production growing rapidly and Russia taking its place among the great industrial powers of the world. But industrialization created new social classes: factory workers, professional managers, educated technicians who demanded political rights and would not accept being ruled like serfs. The contradiction between a modernizing economy and a medieval political system created tensions that the autocracy could not resolve and that eventually tore the country apart. The fourth lesson is about the human cost of empire and the moral reckoning that eventually comes for systems built on exploitation, and oppression. The Romanovs financed their palaces, their armies, and their imperial ambitions through the suffering of millions of people who had no choice in the matter. Serfs worked without compensation so that nobles could live in luxury. Peasants starved so that grain could be exported to pay foreign debts. Workers toiled in appalling conditions so that industrialists could profit. The revolutionaries who overthrew the Romanovs were brutal and often no better than the rulers they replaced. But the revolution did not come from nowhere. It came from 3 centuries of accumulated grievances, from a system that treated the vast majority of the population as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be served. The final image of the Romanov dynasty is those jewels sewn into the corsets of the Grand Duchesses, the desperate attempt to preserve some fragment of unimaginable wealth in a world that had turned completely upside down. Those diamonds represented 3 centuries of extraction, the crystallized labor of millions of people who had lived and died in poverty so that the Romanovs could live in splendor. In the end, the jewels couldn't save the family any more than the gold reserves could save the empire, or the foreign loans could save the government. The system that the Romanovs had built was ultimately unsustainable because it was built on a foundation of injustice that could not bear the weight indefinitely. When the foundation cracked, when war and famine and revolution shattered the illusion of stability, the entire structure came crashing down with a speed that astonished everyone, including the revolutionaries. The Romanovs were not uniquely evil. Many ruling dynasties of their era treated their subjects with similar disregard and extracted wealth through similar methods. But the Romanovs ruled a country of vast size and vast population, which meant that the scale of exploitation was correspondingly vast, and the eventual reckoning was correspondingly terrible. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was one of the most important events of the 20th century, reshaping global politics, inspiring revolutionary movements around the world, and creating a superpower that would challenge Western democracy for 7 decades. That revolution grew directly out of the financial and social policies of the Romanovs, out of the contradictions they created and refused to resolve, out of the bill that came due after 3 centuries of autocratic misrule. The price of gold was paid in blood, the blood of serfs and peasants, of workers and soldiers, and finally of the Romanovs themselves, murdered in a basement by the children of the people their ancestors had exploited. Today, Russia is once again ruled by an autocrat who dreams of imperial glory, and the patterns of Romanov history echo in ways that are both fascinating and disturbing. The dependence on natural resource extraction, the centralization of power, the suppression of dissent, the gap between elite wealth and popular poverty, all of these features of Romanov Russia can be seen in Putin's Russia as well. Whether the modern Russian state will meet a similar fate remains to be seen, but the history of the Romanovs suggests that systems built on exploitation rather than participation, on extraction rather than creation, are ultimately doomed. The Romanov Empire lasted 3 centuries, which seems like a long time until you remember that the Byzantine Empire lasted 1,000 years, and the Chinese imperial system lasted 2,000. 3 centuries was long enough to build magnificent palaces that still stand as tourist attractions, to accumulate art collections that fill some of the world's greatest museums, and to expand Russian territory to its greatest extent. But 3 centuries was not long enough to build a society that could survive the pressures of modern warfare and modern politics, because the Romanovs never invested in the human capital that makes societies resilient. They invested in gold and palaces, in armies and railroads, but not in schools and hospitals, not in political institutions that could channel discontent, not in the kind of social contract that makes people feel invested in their government. When the crisis came, the people had no reason to defend a system that had given them nothing but exploitation, and the Romanovs discovered that all their wealth was worthless when the people finally said enough. The price of empire is always paid eventually, and for the Romanovs, that price was everything: their power, their wealth, and ultimately their lives. Their story stands as a warning to all who would build systems of extraction without consent, of power without accountability, of wealth without justice.